In this part of the lecture, we'll talk about two notable physicians who worked and lived in the first half of the 19th century, M.Mudrov and Friedrich Joseph Haas. M.Mudrov was a person who played a very important role in developing and advancing medical practices, work of medical faculty of Moscow University. He also was a very compassionate doctor and is remembered in history of medicine as one. As for his early life, he was the son of Vologda priest. This priest was notable for his education, poverty, help to the poor, and the fact that he was not interested in taking the money, but rather he was interested in helping others with everything he had. Mudrov graduated from Moscow University in 1800, studied as many of notable Russian physicians and surgeons in European universities. In particular, Mudrov studied at universities and hospitals of Germany, Austria, and France. It was on the eve of the Great Patriotic War of 1812 still. He was elected the Dean of Medical Department of Moscow State University for 5 times. Leo Tolstoy mentioned him in War and Peace. He was a kind of son of Moscow medicine. He had a very extensive private practice, was very well-to-do doctor. Despite that, despite earning quite a lot of money through his private practice, he continued working with poor people. He not only did not charge the money for his medical service, but also gave those poor people medications at his own expense, also gave them the remedies which were considered to be healthy and good for people, for patients in those times, such remedies as tea and wine. He also gave them for free. In 1830, he was appointed a chief physician of Central Commission on Fight Against Cholera, and unfortunately this event was the pretext, the reason why he died. He ran to hospitals during epidemic of cholera in St. Petersburg, got infected, unfortunately, and died. If we return to the topic of his work for Moscow University, in particular its medical department, whose dean he was, we must say that during the Patriotic War of 1812, the medical department was completely destroyed because of the fire. We remember that the French, during this winter, when Napoleon invaded Moscow, they burned quite a lot of buildings in the capital of Russia. Back then it was, of course, not the capital. The capital was St. Petersburg, but the second capital, we can say so. And Mudrov's contribution was the fact that he restored the building, partly even on his own money, because I already mentioned he was quite a well-to-do person due to his private practice. And he also established a clinical institute with 12 beds. In 1820, he created a project and the institute was built and established. Clinical institute was a very important facility because clinic, as we mentioned already at previous classes, was the kind of facility where At the same time, three important functions could be performed. The first function is to treat and to cure patients. The second function was to teach students next to patient's bed. And the third function was to carry out research, to make research using those patients. So this is what clinic basically about. So he created such institutions, not a big one, of course, but still it was something for his period. Mudrov, for the first time in Russian medicine, introduced the system of medical order of interviewing patients. What is the order of questions which the patient must be asked? What are they? How should the patient be interviewed? How the system of case records should be created. So he was the author of first such system in Russia. They say, the historians of medicine mention the fact that for 20 years of his practice, he collected 40 volumes of such case records. And when he was leaving Moscow due to Napoleon's army coming in the direction of Moscow, he abandoned his beautiful library, but he took all those 40 volumes of case records with him, saying that printed books can be found everywhere, whereas case histories nowhere. So it's an example how important his academic and medical work was for him, and then how he appreciated the knowledge, despite the fact that we can imagine how expensive good library in those times had to be. Also, an important feature of his activity was the fact that he saw studying pathological anatomy as a way of developing medicine. He played a decisive role in including this course in curriculum of Russian universities. He encouraged Pirogov, he was his pupil, Sokolsky, to study pathological anatomy, and it was, of course, the impact of Matvey Mudrov on Pirogov that he made anatomy one of his strong points, and the subject which led Pirogov to leave an important trace in history of medicine in Russia. And one more person we are going to talk about here during this lecture on history of medicine of the first half of the 19th century was Friedrich Joseph Haas, or Fyodor Petrovich Haas. He lived between 1780, sorry, it's a mistake on the slide, and of course 1853. Humanity and compassion found the highest expression in life and fate of doctor, philanthrope, social activist, and a saint, Dr. Haas. Muscovites called him the saint sometimes. Friedrich Joseph Haas was a person who was born next to Cologne, but lived the majority of his life in Moscow. And the authors of history of medicine textbooks say that he was the city's beloved Muscovite, one of the city's beloved Muscovites. And he was so important, he was so well known by people that when he died, 20,000 Muscovites came to funeral. All Moscow was in tears, they say. He was a Catholic, born abroad, Yet when he died, Russian Orthodox Church organized memorial services in its churches so that to remember his life and fate. His famous motto was «Спешите делать добро», hurry up for good deeds. Just like Mudrov, he studied abroad, though Mudrov's first education was in Moscow. Of course, being born abroad, has studied at German universities, and he also was a specialist in ophthalmology. He studied this branch of medical science in Vienna University. And it's interesting that when he came to Russia, he was very fast noticed for his activities, and he made a very fast career. He became the head of Moscow Pavlovskaya Hospital very fast. He performed the duties of the head of this hospital between 1807 and 1812. We could say that he was the war hero because he participated as a physician and surgeon in the war, in the Patriotic War of 1812. He came from Moscow to Paris while performing his duties as a doctor. And when he came back to Moscow after the war, he became, just like Mudrov, a very successful physician, earned quite a lot of money via private practice. He had a house next to Kuznetsky Bridge. We can imagine how expensive it had to be. He had an estate in Moscow region and even a factory producing fabric. So we can imagine the scope of his popularity as a doctor, his professionalism, respect. How did it happen that this well-to-do doctor became a very important name in the history of Russian philanthropy? He, even being a very successful and well-to-do physician, from the very beginning he never forgot poor people. He treated poor people, and there was even a saying in Moscow that Haas does not reject any patient, no matter how poor he is. In Russian, у Гааза нет отказа. His philanthropic inclinations, they were noticed by the government. In 1825, Haas, at Moscow General Governor's request, became a chief physician of Moscow, becoming responsible for the city's medical facilities. Unfortunately, when Haas accepted this appointment, the condition of hospitals in Moscow was dreadful. On the one hand, the authorities expected from Haas some activities. On the other hand, the measures suggested were expensive. So eventually authorities ended up with resisting to any changes in the system. Intrigues against Haas followed, and he had to step down in just a year. But he was not forgotten as a person who cares about charitable activities, about poor, about those in need. And in 1829, his life was, from 1829, his life was devoted to the cause of help to prisoners, the most miserable of all poor people. He became a chief physician of Moscow prisons and a Moscow prison committee. The people who are in prisons still remember Haas as the main protector, or we can say patron of prisoners. Here are some of his achievements in changing the system, in changing the attitude towards people who are kept in the Russian prison system. There was a tradition back then that every 12 prisoners, every 12 convicts had to be attached to the heavy iron stick, and they had to move in order to prevent them from running away. So they had to move, having been chained to this heavy iron stick. So he managed to stop this practice of chaining groups of prisoners to one heavy iron stick during prisoner transportation. He also managed to replace heavy fetters, kandali, to heavy fetters with light ones. The fetters which had to replace the former ones. He tried them on himself, trying to check if they caused any discomfort, in order to change them so that to make people's life a bit easier, even in this desperate and very miserable situation. Every prisoner who traveled to other prison via Moscow could have 1 week rest in Moscow transit prison with improved food provision. And for this practice to exist, Haas donated his own money, 11,000 rubles, which was a very large amount of money back then. They say for 20 years Haas came to see of each team of transported convicts and demanded to take fetters from convicts who were ill or weak. He managed to obtain the permission not to shave the hair from the heads of women convicts. He spent his money and the money which he collected from other donors, from the rich members of the society, from his rich friends, on bailing out the serfs. Some serfs, when they were sent into exile, into labor camps, they were sent there without their relatives, but Haas managed to bail out their wives, their children, so that they could accompany their husbands and fathers into exile. He also collected donations on opening up prison hospital for prisoners, school for prisoners' children. Police hospital for the homeless was called by people Haas's hospital. He invested a lot of his money in it. And it's interesting that when he died, there was so little money left, because he donated all the money he had to the cause of his life, that the state had to organize his funeral, because there was no money in Haas's house. Several years after his death, Russian newsletter, Русский Вестник, published an article about Haas, having such citation in: Haas alone, without any power except for power of persuasion, did more then all committees and people in power after him. F.Gaaz was mentioned by classical writers in their fiction books. Authors like Gertsen, Chekhov, Gorky, Dostoevsky, Solzhenitsyn. Many Russian cities in the 19th century had their own doctors whose work was similar to F.Gaaz's. For example, Girshman and Frankovsky in Kharkov, Mering and Yanovsky in Kiev. F.Gaaz's name will always be in the history of Russian medicine and even world medicine. Now they say Roman Catholic Church collects materials about his life and fate, and they want to canonize him to make him the saint.